Welcome to the 292nd of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. Today, I welcome Colleen Derkach, author of Bounding Biomedicine, Evidence calls using the handle at US of Disaster or at COVID calls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. Please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, June 17th, 2021, there are 3,834,719 deaths globally from COVID-19. That's according to the Johns Hopkins team. One have died. As a way to bring some humanity to the numbers, I've been reading a life story or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic in some way, and I'd like to continue that reading now. The headline is Gone But Not Forgotten. Colleagues honor a beloved orderly. And this appeared in the staff newsletter of the Integrated Health and Social Services University Network for West Central Montreal. This appeared November 25th, 2020. Ezra Jeffrey was an orderly who gave to others before he took for himself. He always brought an extra coffee for a colleague. He shared his lunch if someone forgot theirs. And at the annual holiday party, he made a point of dancing with the residents and making them laugh. So when the coronavirus struck last spring, the 71-year-old employee at the St. Margaret Residential Center did what came naturally. Rather than retire, which he could have done, he stayed on to help others until suddenly he needed help himself. One day in 2020, after tending to a resident, Jeffrey became ill. He lost his appetite, felt listless, and went home. 5 weeks later, Mr. Jeffrey was gone. He had succumbed to COVID-19. My father was a hero, says his daughter, Amy Jeffrey. He knew the risks, but he told me he wanted to be there during the crisis to help as much as he could. His work and always looked out for Mr. Jeffrey's death devastated his co-workers at the medical center in West Central Montreal. Over the years, he had earned the loyalty of managers and staff at St. Margaret's for his kindness and devotion. They insisted that he be remembered. Everyone who walks into the seniors' residence on Hillside Avenue in Westmount will be reminded of Mr. Jeffrey. Right inside the main lobby, a sign hangs over a set of double doors, Ezra P. Jeffrey Staff Lounge. Next to it is a plaque bearing Mr. Jeffrey's photo. In loving memory of our PAB, which means beneficiary attendant. It reads, his dedication, conviction, and beautiful smile during his 14 years of service will always remain and forever be a part of St. Margaret's. The tributes were unveiled at a ceremony June 17th of last year. Everyone wore black armbands pinned with a little rainbow. Staff had taken up a collection for Mr. Jeffrey's family and gave them a binder filled with testimonials written on index cards. The words described a man whose character showed in small daily gestures, said Lucy Ann Ferguson, a colleague and friend at St. Margaret's. She remembered that Mr. Jeffrey checked in on her daily when she was sick, and he insisted on driving coworkers home or to the metro if they needed a lift. Vicki Doucette, nurse manager at St. Margaret's, remembers finding her car cleared of snow in the winter. Belatedly, she found out that Mr. Jeffrey was quietly going out to do it. He was a sweetheart. He was like everybody's dad, Miss Doucette says. Excuse me. His death was an awakening. It showed how precious life is. Staff say his passing also underscores the sacrifice of healthcare workers during the COVID-19 pandemic. He was a fallen soldier, says recreation therapist Wendy Foster, who organized the tribute to Mr. Jeffrey with Miss Doucette and Miss Ferguson. We really are and were in a war that nobody signed up for. We were conscripted and it cost a life. Dr. Lawrence Rosenberg, president and CEO of CIUSSS, wrote a letter of condolence to Mr. Jeffrey's family. In it, he praised Mr. Jeffrey's conscientious and compassionate care for residents. His great desire to help others, the mark of a truly dedicated healthcare worker, was evident in his determination to be of service, even though he could have taken a full and well-deserved retirement, he wrote. The homages offered some solace to Mr. Jeffrey's stricken family. Calls also came in from the families of residents, some as far away as Ontario. It shows the impact that my dad had on his coworkers, on residents, and on the whole establishment, says Miss Jeffrey, and that leaves a warm place in my heart. Okay, I'd like to turn to my conversation for today. Let me introduce my guest, Colleen Derkach. Colleen is Associate Professor of Rhetoric in the Department of English at Ryerson University in Toronto, Canada. Her research focuses on rhetoric of health and medicine, particularly regarding the intersections between different understandings of and approaches to health and healthcare. Colleen, thank you so much for joining me on COVID Calls today.
Thanks, it's a pleasure to be here.
So just as we start, a brief program note, I've had a couple of internet slowdowns, and so if we do have a little bit of a lag or slowdown, don't worry. I think that it'll sort itself out. Thank you in advance for putting up with any of that. Let me start the way I usually do, just find out where you're calling from and what the pandemic's looking like there today.
Okay, so I'm calling from Toronto in the Canadian province of Ontario, and Toronto is built upon the traditional lands of many First Nations, including the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Anishinabeg, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Toronto is Canada's largest, biggest city. And so that's where I'm calling from. And how the pandemic is looking today, it's looking pretty good, actually. I think it's been on an upswing. Sort of, we're on the pretty far downhill of the third wave that we had in Ontario. So Ontario, for reference, has about 4.5 million people, or 14.5 million people. So 14.5 million people. Today we had 370 new cases and 7 deaths. And the deaths are significant partly because 2 of those were under 60. So COVID is affecting younger populations. But we were at the crest of the third wave, we were around 4,000 cases a day. So 370 is actually pretty good. We have about 4,400 active cases in the province, and 400 of those cases are in hospital. Good news on the vaccination front as well. So in Ontario right now, 74% of the population over the age of 12 has had 1 or more dose of the vaccine, and 18% of the population has had 2 doses now. So, and I'm calling you as someone who just got her second vaccination last week. So the Delta variant is growing in parts of the province, so that is becoming sort of the chief concern at this moment. It's spreading particularly in northern regions among unvaccinated adults and also among children who are not yet eligible for vaccines. So that's where we're at today.
I'm glad you had the second dose. Thank you for sharing that. Could you tell me again, what was the percentage of people who've had the second dose?
18% has had 2 doses.
18, okay.
Canada, across Canada, we went with a first dose for, there was a phrase they were using, it's a first dose first, I think, strategy of rather than doing the 2 doses in a shorter interval, getting as many people vaccinated with their first shots as possible was the strategy. And so they initially recommended a 4-month gap between doses. So that was far more than adopted elsewhere. And then they've been shrinking the gap slowly. So I got my first shot in March, actually. And so I got mine at 12 weeks. But now they've moved that window. I was one of the AstraZeneca people in Canada. There was like a brief window. All the Gen X people got AstraZeneca. They opened it up to Gen Xers. And so we dutifully got our AstraZeneca shots, and then they cut it off. So
it's the most Gen X thing I can, as a fellow Gen X, I could say that's totally classic for us.
It is the classic Gen X, like every step of the way from us going out and getting our shots and not being recognized for it, to the shots being cut off. And now we're in a really funny place in Ontario, across Canada, because AstraZeneca is no longer being given as a first shot. It is being given as a second shot to people who got it as a first shot. But in all of the information that's being given out, it's really being given out to people who got one of the mRNA vaccines. So Moderna and Pfizer are the two that are licensed here, authorized for use here. And so the AstraZenecas are just, we're stuck kind of nowhere all the time. And so, yeah, it is very true to type for Gen X.
You're the first person I've heard bring that kind of analysis to talking about the vaccination, but it makes perfect sense. And thanks for going into that detail about the vaccination process in Canada. I think we'll return to that, particularly around the health messaging piece. If you don't mind, I'd like to ask another question just about this pandemic period for you. What's your strongest memory or association of this time? Taking into account that it may not be one thing, but if you wouldn't mind sharing one.
I have a few. I think when I think back, in the early days, just how weird and scary it was, and we didn't know what was coming. And in the province of Ontario, we were first advised in March of 2020, we'll shut schools for 3 weeks, and it seemed like we might just kind of go back to normal. And one thing that really sticks out for me is just that kind of it was such a blurry time of, everyone kind of collectively being on kind of the same page, if you will, reading the same news articles, talking about what it might mean. And what I thought was really interesting there was how policymakers and scientists really rose to the kind of the fore, and we began to look to them as oracles. And I think that really stuck out for me because I imagine we'll talk about this in a little bit, but in my first book, I talked about public attitudes towards science and scientists, and how there can be kind of a certain level of skepticism, or, scientists are typically perceived as being so far apart from culture. And suddenly all of these figures became sort of, well, like oracles, really, where people were really looking to them to figure out, like, what will happen to us in the future. And so I found it, the devastation, of course, notwithstanding, because of course that is the most significant thing coming out of sort of maybe the tail end of the pandemic. But beyond that, I thought it was such an interesting cultural moment to look at how people adapted to this moment, to look at how, for me as a language theorist, seeing how people started using epidemiological language in their everyday lives. And so watching terms like social distancing creep into the vernacular, and terms like herd immunity and these other terms that, were widespread maybe in my world, but weren't so broadly spread out in the culture. So I thought that was really interesting. And now we've reached this point of almost like cultural saturation in some ways of experts. So infectious disease experts, epidemiologists, public health authorities, people who often are behind the scenes suddenly came to the fore. And now, there's nicknames for different professionals. And so I think that that's really interesting. One of the public officers of health in Canada, her name's Dr. Bonnie Henry, and people now call her DBH, for example. And so that's something that really sticks out, is how we've become kind of saturated in this really interesting way.
That last detail is interesting. And I'm in South Korea now, and they have a public health official who became this sort of like, and you've even heard people Americans use this term, United States residents use this term, say, he or she is the Tony Fauci of whatever country, as sort of this like stand-in figure for like a public health or researcher or a scientist who becomes a public health communicator, who then becomes really a rock star.
It's so fascinating. And so, but the case of Bonnie Henry is really interesting because she was quite prominent in SARS in Toronto. I can't remember exactly what her role was, but when Toronto I almost said came down with SARS, but when SARS was in Toronto, she was a main figure. And I spent a good part of the winter in the province where she's now the medical officer of health in British Columbia on the West Coast. And you would see little signs outside stores that would have like little cartoons of her, like hand-drawn sort of, I would say caricature, except they were like loving images, and quotes for her because she's well known for saying, "Be safe and be kind." And there was a third thing I don't remember what she says, but so it's one of those things that she's not the Fauci of Canada because she's it's. I don't want to say she's motherly because I think that's too highly gendered, but there's this level of affection that I think is really interesting that, when could you ever name a medical officer of health before? Right?
Exactly. And these become household names. I want to, before we talk about COVID-19, I'd like to get a little bit of background about your first book, Bounding Biomedicine, Evidence and Rhetoric in the New Science of Alternative Medicine. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the project and then maybe how you see that project differently or how you see it now back through the prism of COVID-19.
It's so the key question basically that undergirds that book is, I came to it with the question of how do certain health practices and practitioners come to and maintain ascendancy over others? And so here I'm thinking about the long history in professional medicine, particularly in Canada and the US and in the UK, the professionalization of medicine started beginning in the mid-19th century. With the emergence of the American Medical Association, for example, and issues of professional competition, professional organizations, because in the early days of medicine, doctors really competed in a medical marketplace with like bloodletters and midwives and other figures. And so over time, I was interested in what were the rhetorical or discursive or persuasive processes that shaped sort of the firming up of biomedicine as we now know it as sort of the dominant medical paradigm. As I worked on that project, I came to really see that one of the key factors in the rhetorical negotiation of boundaries between different health practices is the idea of evidence. And so when I say different health practices, I mean, particularly for this book, mainstream biomedicine in relation to practices such as acupuncture or chiropractic or dietary supplements, natural health products. And so the book itself is mobilized by a key question. And the question is, and I actually just state it in the introduction, the question is, how does the notion of evidence determine the boundaries of biomedicine from expert to public contexts? And so what I do in the book, I think there's maybe 5 chapters, and I basically move from what in science studies and other fields is called upstream science, so how science is practiced by experts, and I track that all the way down to science downstream, how it's practiced and how it circulates in public culture. And so I look at, for example, how are clinical trials of practices such as acupuncture and chiropractic, how are they designed? How are those trials interpreted? How are they shared in the literature, and how are they accepted as evidence? And how are these trials applied in practice? So if a patient goes to see their family doctor and they're asking about acupuncture, what does the doctor say? What is the basis of what they say? Where does that come from? And then how are scientific studies of alternative health practices reported in the public? So that's kind of an overview. And I use as a case study or sort of a landmark is I look at a set of theme issues from the journals of the American Medical Association. And so at the time there were 10 journals in all. The number has fluctuated over years, but there's the flagship journal, JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association. And then there were 9 or so associated journals that were specialty journals. So archives of family medicine, archives of psychiatry, archives of, you name the medical specialty, it's represented there. And in 1998, they put out a set of coordinated theme issues on the topic of alternative medicine. And so I use those theme issues as an example of an instance where a professional medical association, through its publication arm, tried to come to reckon with the rising tide of patients seeking health outside of the mainstream system, because the 1990s was a period where there was really an explosion of interest in alternative health practices. So it's just kind of an interesting sight to see how these boundaries are sort of formed and reformed, and how is the idea of evidence mobilized in these discussions.
It sounds like a wonderful project. I wonder if you then could track for us a little bit alternative medicine and those discourses that you were just explaining around evidence and how they're finding themselves into journals and this kind of process. How's that playing out in the pandemic? I mean, you must have been, the minute the pandemic broke out, you must have been very finely attuned to watching those discourses as they emerged.
It's interesting because I kind of had, two different hats on at the same time, because I'm a humanities-based health researcher. So of course it was just a field day for me, but I was also a human being trying to live during a global pandemic as, a parent, as just a person trying to know what to expect next. And like everyone else, I was scared about what the future would look like. So that was really interesting to kind of always have these two narratives running in my head at the same time, because I would read a news article and I would freak out and also be thinking, that's very interesting. So that was really interesting. One of the things I found in the book was that the idea of what counts as evidence in biomedicine is quite elastic. And the idea of evidence gets mobilized differently in different contexts, even among experts. And so that idea of evidence can be harder or softer depending on what we're talking about. And this was interesting during the pandemic as we started to think about what kind of evidence was there for whether and how the pandemic was spreading, how the virus was transmitted, whether and how different treatments worked. I wasn't paying a lot of attention to alternative medicine itself in this moment. I've also, during the pandemic, had my head down writing another book. And so, but one thing I really noticed was how the contingent nature of scientific knowledge is totally normal within the realm of science and scientists, right? Like it's uncontroversial to say within the scientific community that, this is what we know right now in this particular study with these variables, but we don't really know all this other stuff. But those kinds of statements don't fly in the public realm as easily, right? It's quite challenging to talk about contingency in a public realm where we do, journalistic conventions expect, declarative sentences, declarative knowledge. And so that was one thing that really stuck out for me. Also, the ease with which we began to be able to talk about uncertainty. I feel like we were more uncomfortable with uncertainty at the beginning of the pandemic, as a collective, as a public. And I think that over the year, we've become a lot more used to that idea of uncertainty. So I don't think, at least speaking for myself in Toronto, in Canada, my sense is that people don't freak out quite as much when scientific knowledge changes. Like I noticed just today that the national, I can't remember what its acronym is NACI. It's our Canadian Advisory Council on Immunization. Actually, that's what it is, the National Advisory Council on Immunization, or NACI. Just today, they changed their guidelines again about the AstraZeneca vaccine, where now they're recommending that it not even be used as a second shot anymore. And so their guidance has changed, maybe every month or so. And I think people are becoming collectively a little bit more comfortable that we just know more. So that's one of the main things that has really stuck out for me. With respect to alternative medicine during the pandemic, I think that there's, much more of the same in a lot of ways. Some things have changed though, because I think, you see the same kind of disinformation machine grinding along, in YouTube videos with folk cures for various ailments. But I think there's also been a bit of a shift where people I never would have thought would get, for example, a COVID vaccine. People I know who didn't vaccinate their children, that are deeply invested in natural health care and natural health products, are getting vaccinated. And that's been really interesting to see. And related to that is, I'm not on Facebook, but I kind of, I see conversations out of the corner of my eye on my husband's devices. And I'm also seeing sort of self-correction among groups in, like, for example, Facebook comment threads. And that's been interesting to see as well. So kind of the tenor of debate has shifted a little bit. And I think that maybe while there was a little bit of, I don't know, I end Bounding Biomedicine by talking about sort of an ambivalence that runs through American and Canadian culture about science and scientists. And I think that ambivalence has been attenuated just a little bit. I think we're a little more excited about science, maybe.
It's so many interesting things in what you're describing there. One of which I hadn't heard anyone articulate up to now, which is that there may be communities who align themselves with what you might call natural medicine, who also might be vaccine skeptical or maybe even considered anti-vax, and who have then adopted the COVID-19 vaccine, who've then put that aside and gone ahead and had themselves or their family members vaccinated. Is that anecdotal for you, or what do you think about that? That's kind of a stunning observation, actually. I haven't heard anyone talk about that.
I mean, for me, it's anecdotal. I haven't seen any, hard evidence that this is widespread, but I think that, it kind of makes sense. Like, if you think about sort of the rhetorical situation of vaccines and vaccination, it's actually a really tough case, because what you're doing is you're trying to promote an intervention that, if it's effective, will do nothing, right? And that's a hard sell. That's not like, here, take this miracle pill and you'll feel all better and you'll like notice it dramatically. You'll be able to find it on a scan or in a blood test. Like, literally, when it works, you don't know that it works. And I think as so many communicable diseases were reduced or eliminated by vaccines, it sort of created an environment where it was sort of easier to question whether they were all that necessary, right? Because people have, and I think people have good reasons to be concerned about pharmaceuticals and the pharmaceutical industry in some ways. They have good reason to be concerned about toxins in their environments, et cetera. And those things tend to constellate into concerns about products we put in our bodies. And so when it doesn't seem like there's a looming threat, and you feel like everyday life has become, too, what I want to say chemically interfered, but that's not what I want to say. But there were too many chemicals in our lives. Then you might reasonably assume that, vaccines aren't that important. But what we're seeing right now is the real-time effectiveness of vaccines and how they work in populations, right? Like in Ontario, the drop we've had in COVID cases from the peak of the third wave to right now is absolutely astonishing. And it can be linked to the prevalence of vaccines. And so it's really showing in real time that vaccines do work. And then related to that is that vaccines are really our main ticket out of the pandemic. And so I think the stakes have really changed. And when you're dealing in the realm of argument and when you're dealing in the realm of persuasion, different evidence is differently persuasive at different times. And so I think in this case, even if all the other factors remain the same, suddenly that sort of immediacy or the presence of a viral pathogen can actually shift the whole discussion and can actually, I think, help change people's minds. So I'll be really interested to see whether and how that bears out in data down the road. But I think it's a really interesting and exciting for the study of persuasion and for the study of rhetoric and health and medicine, as well as vaccine hesitance, I think, as well.
It really is, and just to come back to something you said a minute ago, just about uncertainty playing out in real time. And I've gone back and forth on how I think about this, and I'll be looking forward to reading what your scholars like yourself and others sort of tell us as you've had more time to sift through, what happened over the last 18 months. But the amount of just health communication and science communication that's been on the front page of every newspaper and every news organization around the world now, so much that we've gotten used to it. That's really strange, first of all. I mean, that amount of saturation of public discussion of science and public angry debate about science, which is scary. It can be irritating to those like myself who might have a predilection towards giving experts and scientists the benefit of the doubt in this kind of moment, or people like ourselves who know that science doesn't go from 1, 2, 3, 4 to the final answer as quickly as the public might usually think. It's exciting to watch. I found it exciting to watch that play out in real time. Maybe my bar, as an American, maybe my bar is too low. I don't know. They have people arguing about science in public. It's like, I'll take that, because to me, at least, that means the discussion is happening. And the debate over, the former president of the United States using his bully pulpit to try to discredit science, that worked with a subset of the population, but with a much larger subset of the population, people said, no. People were able to watch that happen and sort of make some judgments for themselves. I found that really interesting. Again, maybe my bar is too low for what counts as valuable public discourse around science, but what I hear you saying, I think resonates a little bit here too. I mean, it's just been really fascinating, and I think quite important to see it play out this way. In a way, in my lifetime, I've never seen these kind of discussions happening on an ongoing basis, day by day.
And I think that related to that is I think that there's been an increase in nuance in the ways that we talk about fears people have, because I think when it comes, for example, to vaccine hesitance, I have pretty much unlimited patience for people who are concerned about vaccines, because I think that underneath, if we really dig at what people are concerned about, and it may be based on mistaken information, and it may be just deliberately misleading information, but if you dig underneath that, typically you find good people with good reasons trying to do the right thing. And then it's how we're making decisions and what evidence we weigh, and all those factors really become really important. And so I've been noticing a shift in tone, for example, around people who are concerned about vaccines, because there's been a real effort to reach out to people and to recognize that it's okay to feel scared. It's okay to feel hesitant. It's okay to wonder what's in the products that are being put in your body. And so I found that there's just been a level of nuance that I think is really interesting. And I've had lots of conversations myself. I've been, a person that friends have texted and say, like, okay, so can you explain why, for example, these vaccines were produced so quickly, right? Because I think that's something that, to someone who isn't versed in the nature of scientific research, it seems like worryingly fast, right? And I think that for scientists, for health professionals, policymakers, et cetera, it's just like, it makes sense that the vaccines were produced so fast. But for someone who, has this understanding that scientific research is really slow and takes forever, it could be really quite concerning. And so if you engage with people where they are rather than where you think they should be, you're going to have different results. And I think that that's something that's, as vaccines have come to market and are being distributed, I've seen a shift in the way those conversations are unfolding in a way that I think is really great, because I think it's increasingly experts and policymakers are meeting people where they are.
Just a reminder, you're listening to COVID Calls, and I'm talking to Colleen Durketch today on COVID Calls. And I want to I'm going to stay with this a minute because I found an article from last year in which you were quoted talking about the public health communication situation in Canada. And you used a phrase which I had not seen before. You called for epistemic humility among Canadian officials. That really jumped off the page to me. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that term and what provoked you to sort of call for that.
Well, it's not original to me. It's not my term. I actually cannot remember where it comes from, but it comes from the science studies literature. I know that much. I know it comes
one of our listeners will tell us, no doubt. It's
okay.
Fine.
I look forward to being called out on this. It's not my term, but it refers to really being humble about what you know and don't know, being aware of the limits of your knowledge. And this is really one of the kind of founding principles within science is to be very aware of, in any given context, what are the limits of what you know about the knowledge you've produced. And it's so interesting from a rhetorical perspective because as we've all collectively been so deeply concerned over the last year as the pandemic has unfolded. Experts who previously were like backstage, really most of the time, policymakers, public health scholars, infectious disease doctors, who typically are, just working in hospitals and in labs and are not typically on newscasts and on Twitter, suddenly they were thrown into the fore, and people were looking desperately to them for information. And it hasn't always been a smooth transition. And I think that is something that is important. Experts in a given scientific specialty typically are not experts, for example, in science communication. And that's been, a challenge. So it's been wonderful to see different figures, in the media, talking to the public, engaging on Twitter. But there has at times been a lack of self-consciousness about what these individuals are able to weigh in on with sort of a deep understanding. And, communication obviously is a bit of a sore spot for me because that is what I do. And there are experts in fact, I would say I'm not an expert in health communication because I think there are others who are far more expert than even I am. And I think that's been, the assumption that because you know words and can talk and have a platform that somehow you are in a particular position to be communicating with the public is challenging, I think. And so I've seen some instances where individuals who are expert in one particular area relevant to the pandemic just suddenly start kind of weighing in on everything. Mm-hmm. And then you watch, in my local city, there are a range of experts who have over this process gotten blue check marks on Twitter and have become really prominent public figures. But I can tell when they've said something, even without seeing their feed, because you just see kind of the reverberations through, social media about whatever they've said. And oftentimes it's not things that they're expert about. They're just kind of weighing in because they feel like it. And so the idea of epistemic humility there is just really becoming aware of the limits of your knowledge. And so for me, I take it personally sometimes because often it's in the realm of well, here's an example. So once I was part of a group of scholars that met to talk about immunization. And it was a multidisciplinary group that had scholars in English, people that are experts in language, for example, some literary scholars, historians, but also public health researchers and practitioners, epidemiologists, and so on. And so we would meet. And the conversations became quite circular because the scientists on this panel kept insisting that what we needed is more and better information, that if we gave people better facts, they would simply decide to immunize their kids and it would be game over. So we had discussions about maybe we should have more pictures of sad children that would convince parents to vaccinate their kids. And there was really no acknowledgement of the actual experts in the room who were expert in helping change people's minds, helping understand why people make the decisions that they make, because you really have to understand the decisions that people make before you can intervene. And so in that group, not to call out that one group, it was a pleasure in lots of ways, but it was just really challenging because there was an assumption that if you understand vaccine science, that you understand how to make people get vaccinated. And those two things, they're not actually that closely related, because that position is based on the fundamental assumption that people value science as much as you do. And for a lot of people, science is one of many factors they consider when they make decisions about their health.
I'm glad to get into this discussion. I was actually talking with Travis Chi Wing Lau, who's professor of English at Kenyon College earlier this week, and it was a mind-expanding conversation. He's so brilliant, but he wrote an essay during the pandemic called "Against the Hot Take," and it gets into some of this area that you're talking about. And scientists who appear, public health researchers, epidemiologists across the board, people who have some expertise related to the pandemic, who appear on Twitter and they have the blue check, and a lot of them have really big, followings, and they're also human beings, so they may want to. I think it's really hard for them. I've tried to observe this. There's areas that's obviously their lane, and they're going to talk about, clinical trials, or they're going to talk about, infection rates, whatever it is they're going to talk about. But of course, as a human being, they're speculating about many other things that are related to the pandemic. And then they might also want to talk about sports, or they might want to talk about the weather. I mean, there's other things that they may want to weigh in on, because social media doesn't tell you have to stay in your lane. This is not a peer-reviewed tweet, although maybe that should come up. I don't know. Maybe we should talk about that. But I thought that was interesting that he was making that point, and it seems like you're attentive to that concern too, and trying to be sympathetic to. I mean, I want scientists in this public communication space, but what I don't want is that to come at the expense of other kinds of experts, social scientists and humanists, who might actually have a much more important role to play around certain parts of the pandemic and communication, and it gets smashed. And that seems to be kind of what you're describing in that interesting case you were relating.
Yeah. And I think, there's so much interesting stuff in what you just said, and I can't, I won't be able to address it all, I'm sure. But I think that, first of all, I'm not a social media expert. So there's one of those limits. I'm a communication specialist, but social media isn't my bag. But the thing is that, we are all multifaceted individuals, right? With all of our interests. And Twitter, academics on Twitter and researchers on Twitter is really interesting. I mean, anyone on Twitter, it's really interesting because sometimes we tweet in a professional capacity, sometimes we don't. And it really depends on, like, for me, my Twitter account is a bit of a hot mess in some ways, right? So I will, I'll say something and it will go semi-viral. It'll be like a thread about academia, and then I'll get a ton of new academic followers. And then the next day I'll go on a tear about public health communication, and then I'll get a different set of followers. And then the next day I'll tweet something really stupid about snowboarding or something. Or yesterday I was tweeting about Ren and Stimpy, right? And I think that
I liked that, by the way. Keep going.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I'm not going to do it in the end. The question was whether I should quote Ren and Stimpy in my new book or not, but I'm not going to. I'm going to act like a grown-up. But so we're always kind of occupying these different selves simultaneously. And the thing about being the blue check presence on Twitter is that the blue check is like a kind of almost like an imprimatur, right? Like it's a stamp of approval. It's saying that this is a person who is a public figure, and we're acknowledging that this, genuinely is them. But it comes with a kind of a rhetorical weight to it, right? It has a significance that circulates, and I think that that's something that individual Twitter users, I think we need to be mindful of that. Those with blue checks, it comes with an obligation to sort of your constituencies when you tweet from under a blue check. It's not the same as, being like, I don't know, redcat123_49 on Twitter, right? Like it's
right.
it comes with, there's a social weight to that I think is really significant. And, this is something I've thought about as I've, moved up in followers myself. I'm not anywhere near blue check territory at all. But, I do think a little bit more about what I say, because there is that kind of, there's also a question of audience. That's the other thing, is that social media kind of throws communication into a very interesting sort of blender, because the audience, when we think about communication, audience is always one of the most important things, right? It's not just what we say, or how we say it, but who do we say it to? Who are we addressing? Because who we're addressing will change what we say and how we say it. And social media is interesting for that reason, because you have many different types of audiences. So it's not just a reader of a peer-reviewed journal or a person at a conference presentation, for example. It's kind of just anyone who's around and sees it. And so there's lots of really interesting stuff to unpack there. And I have some colleagues who have done some work on looking, for example, at Epi-Twitter, as it's known, Twitter among epidemiologists. A colleague of mine, Scott Graham, who published a book, I think earlier this year, later last year, called Where's the Rhetoric? And one of the things he talks about there is sort of the rise of Epi-Twitter, or epidemiological Twitter, and the, I'm trying to remember what he calls it now, but it's a certain type of tweet that packs in a lot of data. So you're seeing these kind of daily updates of how many cases there are, how many people are in hospital. I'm sure you know this. I wish I could remember the name of the type of tweet he called it. But colleagues like that are trying to kind of understand, how does this relatively new way of communicating scientific knowledge sort of stabilize into kind of more recognizable forms, over time. And that it will be interesting to see how those kinds of tweets sediment, sort of as we move maybe out of the pandemic, hopefully out of the pandemic. I circled around there. I forgot where I started.
No, that's good. And it does get right back into this sort of question about epistemic humility too, I think. And I don't know if you follow Peter Hotez on Twitter. People might have seen him a lot on cable news. Also, he's and for right-wing smear campaign, and he actually engages it. So if someone says, "Hey, you're going on TV and lying to the public," or people comment on his tweets, one of the most common ones is, "You're paid off by the vaccine industry," and he engages them. Not every single one of them, but it's really, I've been fascinated to what, and it must be enormously time consuming for him. Right. So he takes the time to do it. And I think his idea there is twofold. One is that not everybody who criticizes a public science official is that invested in their own criticism. And so maybe, a response in good faith could get some percentage of people to back away, or to say, "Oh, I hadn't thought about that. Sorry, I called you a bad name, and I'm going to learn from this experience." But also just that everyone else is watching. Mm-hmm. And so when scientists do back down or sort of censor themselves from the beginning, just say, "Oh, I'm not going into Twitter because it's just too dangerous out there," there's an opportunity for communication that's missed as well. And, I don't know when he sleeps, because he spends a lot of time kind of engaging in that work, but he sees that as, I believe, I don't want to put words in his mouth, he's been a guest on COVID Calls, but I think he sees that now as part of the spectrum of appropriate activities for scientists. Mm-hmm. That's part of the science. I'm fascinated by that. I wonder what you may think about that.
Well, I think, I agree. I think that one of the central arguments in bounding biomedicine, particularly toward the latter end, is that the realm of what we consider science is actually much broader than I think we traditionally believe. So when we think about what science is, we usually think about scientists at benches doing stuff, with like Bunsen burners or whatever, cool, like bubbling beakers, and or in peer-reviewed research. But science is practiced at in really a broad array of activities, everything from bench science all the way out to public public science and public scientists. And so scientists who read other scientists, like armchair nonfiction books, right? And how science circulates in public. And I think that is something that I think science on Twitter is really exciting. I think that there's, I think that we need to think a little bit about kind of public responsibility, but I think having access to science and scientists in all of their kind of full-bodied experience and existence is actually really good for the public, I think, because, in the realm of research that I inhabit, so alternative medicine I had been working on, and now I've moved into the realm of wellness, which is still in the realm of natural health. There's kind of a skepticism and concern about science and scientists. And so I think that there's value in watching how scientists sort of make up and change their minds, how they communicate, how they engage. And I think that there's increasing, understanding of, for example, peer review processes that, like I'll just hear people like, in the park, if I'm walking through a park, and I'll hear people talking about, well, I heard there was a new preprint today that blah, blah, blah. And they've heard about it in the news. They've heard about it on Twitter. And there's this increasing understanding of what that means. Now, I want to say, just as a sidebar, that I don't mean to suggest that there ever was a public deficit of scientific knowledge and that people just didn't know enough about science. I think it's much more complicated than that. So I'm not saying that people were just ignorant and now they're less ignorant. I think actually the engagement of scientists on Twitter is actually, I'm trying to think of this, it's a good way of kind of bridging sort of the gap, if you want to call it a gap, or the distance in expertise between members of the public and science. Instead of expecting the public to build the bridge out to understand science, it's almost scientists are building the bridge the other way. And I think that that's really exciting. And I think and I'm using the word scientist really broadly here to refer to anyone from public health to, you know what I mean. Watching them change their minds and engage with people, I think, has been really good. And also to be persistently reminded by people who reply about sort of the human and public element of the things that they're discussing. Like, I think that there is that kind of built-in feedback loop that I think is important, because it's easy to lose sight of, the people who are affected by, or the stakeholders of your research.
Talking to Colleen Durketch today on COVID Calls about the rhetoric of science, and I love the image of you walking past a dog park or anywhere, eavesdropping for science, the way that people communicate about science. That's, again, the sort of the blurring of the lived experience of a human in the pandemic and the researcher, which I've talked to lots of other people about, that sort of uncanny nature of being what I call a disaster researcher generally, who's also living through this. A couple other things I'd like to get to if you have time. I definitely want to find out about the new book. And so maybe because you referenced it a couple times about the concept of wellness. Tell us about the new project and how, again, starting a new project while the biggest pandemic in the last 100 years is unfolding. How does that take you out of what does that do to your research notes that you had on the table before February 2020?
That's a great question. So I'll start just kind of with the sort of outline of it. So it's called Why Wellness Sells. Natural health in a pharmaceutical culture. I think that's what it's called. And so it's under contract with Johns Hopkins, and it is it's under advanced contract. Sorry. So it still is going out for peer review. I just finished the final draft, or the first draft, like last week. And so I'm just kind of finishing things up before I send it out, before it goes for review. And it's interesting, so that you just went back to sort of the study of disaster in general, and in fact, sort of kind of the guiding theoretical idea behind why wellness sells. So kind of the thing that's informing my methodology actually comes from disaster preparedness. So there's kind of an interesting connection there. So I'm interested in discourses about wellness, and there's lots of evidence now that the idea of wellness sells, right? We get it, right? There's Netflix shows debunking different wellness trends. There's exposés about Gwyneth Paltrow out there. There's Barbara Ehrenreich has a fairly recent book about debunking the aging and wellness industry. So we now know that wellness sells, but we don't really know why. And so the goal of my project is to explain why wellness sells. And what I argue is that the language of wellness is a self-generating language, or in fancy terms, it's an autopoietic language. And I take the idea of autopoiesis from a colleague of mine, Lisa Karanen, who is at the University of Denver, or Colorado, Denver. And she published about rhetorics of disaster preparedness, and how in the realm of disaster preparedness, as we talk about disasters and prepare for disasters, our idea of risk becomes elevated. And as our idea of risk becomes elevated, we prepare more for disaster. So there's this kind of circular motion. So she called this discourse autopoietic, which means self-generating. It's a term that comes from cell biology. How cells can be self-generating units. And so I pick up on her idea of rhetorical autopoiesis, or how arguments self-generate, to make the case that wellness sells because it is essentially a self-generating discursive system, or a self-generating language. And so in the book, I explain that when we talk about wellness, we're always moving. And when I say we, I mean, collectively, those of us who live in Canada and the US for sure, and in many other parts of the world. When we talk about wellness, we typically draw on one of two logics. We draw on what I call the logic of restoration, which is the idea of restoring our bodies to previous states of functioning, and the logic of enhancement, which is about optimizing our bodies to become better than well, as the bioethicist Carl Elliott once said. And so the logic of restoration, when we're thinking about wellness in that logic, we're thinking about, I'm going to take supplements to, I've had insomnia. I'm going to take some supplements so that I sleep better, so that I can get back to the way I was, right? Whereas the logic of optimization or enhancement is, I've been sleeping fine, but maybe I can sleep even better, right? Or maybe I can even be more productive, or have better concentration, or be more energetic. And so what I've found in various data sets that I've analyzed, so I conducted 40 interviews with people who are interested in wellness and natural health. I've analyzed online comments on petitions about Canadian legislation about natural health products, and other cultural sources. And what I found is that we move quite seamlessly between these two logics, the logics of restoration and enhancement. And what I found is that the tension between these two logics actually drives interest in wellness discourse, because we just slip easily between one or the other. So I examine wellness across what I call, actually, it's really funny. So I analyze wellness as it moves through, or is driven by 6 vectors. And it's funny that I called it vectors, because this was a year before the pandemic when I came up with this idea. And now, we all kind of broadly understand what vectors are, right? So drivers of, contagion. And so it's funny that I picked that metaphor as kind of the organizing metaphor for my book. So in 6 chapters, I track what I see as the 6 vectors driving wellness discourse, where wellness is a form of incipient illness, or kind of, illness in waiting. It's something we have to monitor and maintain, rather than just leave it be, but we have to track it like an illness. Wellness as a form of self-management, governing ourselves, being good health citizens. And then a way of reducing harms of sort of everyday toxic life. And then I look at several other vectors besides, to try to just explain why is wellness so prominent.
And so that's so that sounds like an amazing project. And how has the pandemic, if it has, have you gone back and looked at the data set somehow differently? Has it changed your analysis at all? Or maybe it's accentuated certain parts of it that you hadn't thought were as important before. That's certainly been the case, I think, for so many researchers. It didn't change their trajectory, but there are certain parts of it that are now really, really strongly demonstrated, like this issue you were talking about the way disaster preparedness works, for example.
I'm very happy to report that it holds, that my argument holds and is reinforced. Right now, I'm having a debate with myself about how much to discuss the pandemic in the book, because there's going to be an awful lot of books about COVID in the near future. And I think this is about something that kind of, precedes and will outlast the pandemic. So I'm just kind of thinking about that right now. And I wrote 4 of the 6 chapters before the pandemic. So I'm thinking, how do I fold that in? But really it reinforced my arguments. And so it really reinforced the arguments I make about how deeply concerned people are about the kinds of harms that surround us in everyday life, whether it is toxins in the environment, whether it's chemicals and pharmaceuticals, or whether it's a virus moving through populations. And I think that the thing that really sticks out for me the most is the 4th chapter is about wellness as a survival strategy, I call it. And what I mean by a survival strategy, that chapter really, the key word of that chapter is exhaustion. And I'm drawing from sort of the great literary and cultural theorist Lauren Berlant, and she talks about exhaustion and ways people try to recover from exhaustion. And so in that chapter, I talk about how wellness becomes a way for people to carve out spaces for bodily pleasure or bodily respite in lives that are really overburdened. And so wellness can become kind of a way of feeling like, you're filling up your cup, by saying like, I'm going to, one of the things I talk about is Rescue Remedy, which is a natural remedy for stress that's made of various botanicals. And, does it work? Who knows? But it's sold as something that's a kind of an instant relief that you can take if you're experiencing stress. You can just, pop one of the pastilles, or you can drop a couple drops from a dropper on your tongue, and you'll just, chill. And products such as this are kind of targets of a lot of, cultural criticism, for being snake oil, et cetera. But I think that one of the things products like this do is help us feel like we're just able to take care of ourselves for 5 minutes. And this is something that I've really noticed as institutions over the last year made a lot of noise about wanting to support employees, for example, wanting to support students. But yet many of the workload expectations have carried on. They've remained largely the same. And yet, we've got kids running around our houses. We're in, the domestic and professional spheres really have collided in these ways that are really tricky. And, not to slam my own institution, because I think this is happening everywhere, but, then we'd get, sort of mass emails saying like, don't forget to have a bubble bath because these are stressful times, without any of the institutional protections that are there to help workers, get through this period, this difficult period. And so that chapter, I think, resonated the most for me, kind of coming out of this end of the pandemic, is that, we are exhausted, I think, collectively. And for some of us, our burdens are much greater than others. And so this kind of really radically individualized approach to wellness, I think can potentially be quite harmful, but certainly it's understandable why people are drawn to that, because you don't really have any other potential outlets for trying to recuperate from the stresses of everyday life.
It's really profound observation. And I remember even before the pandemic, it's like back rubs for department heads, kind of thing. It's sort of moving around, different ways that people under great stress in an institution, let's say a university, cope with your individual stress through these wellness techniques. And of course, my thought was always, well, maybe just reduce the workload. I mean, maybe
right.
This is not an individual. This is a problem that manifests itself individually, but it's structural. And so, and that sort of, I know that's something you think a lot about too, this sort of back into the sort of broader public health conversation, like focusing on the individual's behavior when yeah, that's important, but there's a limit to what an individual can or can't do in terms of stopping the pandemic by wearing a mask. I mean, you want them to wear it, but I don't know how to resolve that tension. I'll leave that there.
I mean, it's a big problem, right? And that's one of the sort of the central arguments in my book. Like, I have unlimited patience, really, well, mostly unlimited patience for people who engage in health practices that, may not seem supported or are not supported by scientific evidence. It doesn't mean I endorse the practices, but it means that I understand where people are coming from, because I think you're absolutely right. People are trying to find solutions wherever they can find them, right? It's kind of like the idea of puppy rooms on campus, university campuses during exam time, to try to alleviate, stress and, prevent suicide among university students. And puppies are wonderful, but that's not going to fix the problems that are at play. And I think that that's, a core argument through the book I'm just finishing right now, is that until we address those bigger issues, we're not really going to get anywhere in stemming the tide of people that are seeking, different health practices that, may have no evidence supporting their practice, but it's people trying to do something that they have any agency over. And so we need to look at what are those problems, what are people concerned about? And this circles back into the same questions we discussed already about vaccines, right? You need to understand why people are concerned about vaccines, really, if you want to address issues of vaccine hesitance.
So I've kept you too long. We had people should follow you on Twitter, because you do go into some of these issues also in that space. I think you're a good, I don't know what the right term is, maybe it's sort of a science rhetoric communicator, and you, I've learned a lot by following you, and I think in this discussion as well, and we look forward to that project coming out with Hopkins Press. And you said it should be maybe later this year, it sounds like.
Yeah, it's going in for peer review, and then, however scholarly publication works out, maybe next spring. We'll see.
Okay, and it's gonna be, and you said it's not necessarily about the pandemic, and the argument still holds. This is going to be a strange selling point for authors throughout this time who are going to say, this is a book not about COVID.
Yeah.
I'm losing my audio and video today intermittently, and so I want to thank my guest, Colleen Derkach, for putting up with that. And want to remind everybody you've been listening to COVID Calls, and you can catch COVID Calls most weekdays at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Join us back next week. Join me Monday, actually, when Felicia Henry will be guest hosting again, and she guest hosted for the first time this week. It was a tremendous conversation. So please do join COVID Calls on Monday at 5:30 Eastern Time for that. And let me again thank Colleen Derkach for this time, and for really touching on so many really interesting topics today. Thanks, Colleen.
Thank you so much.
Stay healthy, everybody. We'll see you on Monday at 5:30.